Hi everyone, it's Nick at Final Descent UK. Thanks for joining us for this month's AAIB Debrief. We've got 2 commercial and 1 general aviation incident to discuss this month. Remember to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Let's get going. First, we'll discuss a British Airways 777-200 incident at Gatwick on the 28th of June 2024. Golf Victor India India Tango, operating as Speedbird 2204, was planned to fly to Vancouver. It began its takeoff roll on runway 26 left, and on hearing the automated V1 call out, the co-pilot, who was pilot flying, began to retard the thrust levers instead of removing his hands from them as per the standard operating procedure. At the same time, the commander called rotate as the aircraft passed the rotation speed. However, the co-pilot vocalised his error, momentarily advancing the thrust levers again, but then decided to perform a rejected takeoff. The aircraft stopped just before intersection Golf Romeo, which is around 500 metres from the runway end, and the right main landing gear caught fire due to the hot brakes caused by the rejected takeoff, which was extinguished by the airport fire and rescue service. The 777-200 weighed 248 tonnes, which was around 20 tonnes below its maximum takeoff weight. The weather was good, with a dry runway surface, and the calculated V-speeds were V1 of 160 knots, a rotation speed of 161 knots, and V2 was calculated at 165 knots. The thrust levers were retarded at 160 knots and then again at 162 knots, and a maximum speed of 167 knots was reached before stopping. British Airways' own analysis couldn't identify any exacerbating factors for the incident, and the morning was described as unremarkable for the crew, and there was no distraction or workload issues to consider. The co-pilot had 6,156 hours of flight time, with a total of 2,700 on the 777. He hadn't flown for the last 10 days as he'd been away on holiday. The co-pilot expressed surprise at the inadvertent thrust reduction and wasn't able to explain it. He was concerned that the aircraft would not have sufficient performance for a successful takeoff after the thrust reduction and reapplication, which is why he called for the rejected takeoff. The crew otherwise calmly responded to the rejected takeoff, and it was handled effectively. Now, pilots will perform the action of removing their hands from the thrust levers on every flight, so it becomes a highly learned motor action. Errors in such sequences are termed action slips. Absence of cognitive thought and speed of execution is common in such events, and the AAIB has previously reported on similar incidents, for example where flaps have been raised instead of landing gear. This was the case in July 2018, where the pilots of a Flybe-8Q400 registration Golf Juliet Echo Delta uniform raised the flaps instead of the gear. That flight continued without further incident. The investigation didn't consider whether other scenarios such as a change in weather, weight or crew action could have led to a different outcome. British Airways had only very recently published guidance on methodical control selections and promoted the topic of focus in human factors training and briefing material. There were no AAIB safety recommendations following this investigation. However, when the report was published, it did make the front of BBC News. Make of their report what you will. Next, we'll discuss the fatal accident of a Cirrus SR22 Turbo Golf Romeo Golf Sierra Kilo at Duxford Airfield in Cambridgeshire on the 26th of March 2024. The 58-year-old pilot with 115 hours of flight experience had commenced his flight at 13:10 and intended to remain in the right-hand circuit for runway 06 right at Duxford. The aircraft was relatively new and had only flown 40 hours in total, of which 24 hours were for the delivery flight between the US and the UK, meaning only 16 hours had been flown by the owner. There were no aircraft faults or malfunctions recorded at all during this time. The pilot completed his private pilot's license training in a Cirrus SR20 and had over 82 flights in that type of aircraft. The pilot's instructors reported that sometimes he was inconsistent during his training, especially after a time away from flying, but didn't think this was particularly out of the ordinary for a student pilot at that stage. Because the SR22 has a turbocharged engine, differences training is required before legally flying this type solo in the UK. The pilot had achieved that training with 4.2 hours in the type with a qualified Cirrus instructor. The pilot completed 3 circuits at Duxford without incident. There was no conflicting traffic on the final circuit before the accident, and the weather was good with light winds at 7 to 8 knots and visibility more than 10 kilometres. On touchdown after the 3rd circuit, Golf Sierra Kilo bounced and full power was applied by the pilot. The crash sequence was caught on video by a witness, and I'm going to show that now. As you can see, the aircraft remained low with the nose slightly high and a left angle of bank, pointing about 45 degrees left of the runway centreline, with the bank angle increasing to 90 degrees with the left wing low, which then struck the ground, followed by the nose of the aircraft. The aircraft was severely damaged, and you can also see the ballistic parachute recovery system deploy as part of the accident sequence. As I've mentioned, the pilot suffered fatal injuries. This plan view shows the flight path during the accident. Another aircraft was lined up on runway 06 left for takeoff, and the pilots witnessed the bounce and go-around attempt. This image shows the damage to the aircraft post-crash, and as you can notice, the cords of the Cirrus airframe parachute system coming from the top of the aircraft going off towards the right-hand side of it. The pilot was strapped in, and the aircraft's shoulder strap airbags had deployed. I suppose you could consider the Cirrus SR22 the Lamborghini of light aircraft, and this was a top-of-the-range model. It was fitted with onboard oxygen and air conditioning, and these needed to be depressurised after the accident to prevent injury to the recovery and investigation crews. In fact, a car mechanic was called in this case to discharge the air conditioning gases, as the systems are very similar between aircraft and cars. The aircraft also carries a crash-hardened data recovery module which contains flight data on an SD card. The recovered data showed that during the final circuit there was a spiking acceleration to 1.4 G suggesting the initial touchdown, and then a second spike of 1.67 G indicating the bounce. The aircraft then pitched up to 8.4 degrees and started the roll to the left. Power was increased from 8 to 116% over 2 seconds, with the stall warning activating. As the engine power increased, the aircraft pitched up further, continued its left roll and began yawing to the left, holding a roll attitude of 40 degrees until the end of the flight. As soon as the engine power was increased, the yaw rate to the left increased, then remained at between 7 and 18 degrees per second, meaning the aircraft was consistently yawing until the end of the flight. Now, applying power to a single engine aircraft with a clockwise rotating propeller, such as the SR22 and many other light aircraft, leads to various aerodynamic effects causing significant roll and yaw to the left. The corkscrew effect of the slipstream, the torque reaction to the rotating engine and propeller, gyroscopic effects of the propeller, and asymmetric blade effect at high angles of attitude all add together to cause this phenomenon. Now, this isn't unique to the SR22, and all single-engine piston pilots know the importance of applying right rudder. However, consider now how powerful the SR22 is. If we compare this to the SR20 that the pilot was more familiar with, the SR22 is almost a third more powerful. Unfortunately, this isn't the first incident involving loss of control of SR22 variant aircraft during go-around execution. The AAIB identified that 5 of the 7 similar incidents involving go-arounds followed bounced landings. In 2023, an accident in Australia involving Victor Hotel X-Ray Golf Romeo found that the pilot was unable to counter the substantial torque effect associated with high engine power, leading to loss of control and collision with the ground. The AAIB also notes that some of the other similar incidents involved more experienced pilots and sometimes even with instructors on board, perhaps suggesting that the aircraft is challenging to fly in such circumstances even with experience, and the table shows the range of experience of the pilots involved in the similar accidents. So in summary, an inexperienced pilot of a powerful light aircraft didn't respond appropriately to aerodynamic changes following application of full power, leading unfortunately to the accident and the pilot's death. All the channel's thoughts go to his family and friends. The third and final incident we'll discuss involves an Aer Lingus ATR 72600, registration Golf Charlie Mike Juliet Mike, departing from Edinburgh Airport on the 31st of October 2023. On takeoff, the right wheel from the nose landing gear detached from the aircraft, but this wasn't observed by anybody, and the flight crew were unaware of the problem. The aircraft completed its flight and successfully landed at Belfast City Airport, where the ground crew informed the commander that the nose wheel was missing. Both airports carried out a runway inspection, and the wheel was found at the side of the runway in Edinburgh. Further parts were found in a few more locations, as shown on the plan view of the airport. The image of the aircraft clearly shows the missing nose right wheel, which showed evidence of heat damage. There was no evidence of fluid leakage or other damage to the aircraft elsewhere. There was no recent hard landing or abnormal runway contact on recent flights to explain why the wheel may have become damaged. Subsequent inspection and research found that the axle failed due to a fracture caused by overheat of the bearings in the wheel. No cause of this could be positively identified. However, it's suspected that non-conformance with approved maintenance practices could have contributed. There are 3 record-only reports in this month's bulletin, so we've got enough time to briefly cover them. First, a model aircraft, an MA Pilot RC Laser, which has a wingspan of 1. Hello, Noah. This is Noah the cat. So an MA Pilot RC Laser, which has a wingspan of 1.8 meters, approximately 6 feet, began a left turn, but the left horizontal stabilizer and elevator broke away from the fuselage. The aircraft entered a spin and struck the ground outside of the flying field's perimeter hedge, close to a cyclist. Second, a DJI Mavic 3 drone in Lewisham. Its obstacle sensors were turned off and it hit a tree, crashing to the ground. And third and finally, a Tubery X10 Pro, which is a sub 250 gram drone, experienced a flyaway event whilst conducting a survey flight over a built up area. It was never seen again. Thanks again for joining us for this month's AAIB Debrief. Remember to like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. See you again next month. Bye bye.